Today's rule covers two items, both of which will be familiar to members who were here during the 116th Congress. We are once again considering H.R. 1, a bill that nationalizes our election system and substitutes Washington's judgment for a key responsibility of our states in the administration of free and fair elections. We are also considering H.R. 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. Unfortunately, despite its title, H.R. 1 has nothing at all to do with the people. It is instead a bill about preserving the present Democratic majority. It's a bill by Democrats, for Democrats. Though the majority claims this bill is about reforming our political system, the reality is most of the changes in this bill, if enacted into law, would be to benefit the majority and to the detriment of the minority. The most egregious of these provisions are those dedicated to changing our national system of campaign finance. Now, in general, I think this is a worthy goal, but the majority's proposed solution does not make much sense. The majority is proposing to create a new federally funded campaign ATM using corporate fines, ensuring that certain candidates will receive millions of dollars just for running a campaign. My colleagues in the majority have bemoaned the massive amount of money that's been entering into our campaign system over the past few decades, and yet their proposed solution is to dump corporate dollars into the system. In what world does this make sense? Even Democrats know what a flawed program this is, which is why today's rule also includes a provision to allow members of Congress to opt out of this program. Before this bill was even passed by the House, Democrats were already running from it. They should just keep running and pull this bill from the floor. Other proposed changes in this bill are just as egregious. Wherever possible, the majority is attempting to impose one-size-fits-all systems from Washington onto the states. It does this with one-size-fits-all voter registration system, including forcing states to provide same-day voter registration whether they want to or not. And it takes away the power of the states to choose how to redistrict, forcing them to adopt a Washington-imposed, quote, independent redistricting commissions, unquote, something that less than 20% of the states who undertake redistricting actually do. These provisions impede the traditional power of the states to control their own elections. As a former Secretary of State and election official in my home state of Oklahoma, I find these changes to be particularly concerning. But what's worse, H.R. 1 also includes severe restrictions on free speech and repeals the lowest learner rule, a rule put into place after the IRS began targeting the speech of conservative organizations in determining whether or not they would qualify for tax-exempt status. If enacted into law, these provisions would re-weaponize the IRS and limit the abilities of organizations, corporations, and individuals to freely exercise this most important right guaranteed under the Constitution. How the majority can claim that this bill is for the people when they are blatantly restricting the people's right to free speech is beyond my understanding. Mr. Speaker, what the majority is attempting today is egregious, changing the national campaign finance system to benefit themselves, taking traditional powers away from the states, and restricting the right of free speech are all part of an unprecedented power grab. I strongly urge the majority to change course and urge my colleagues to reject this terrible bill. Today, we are also considering H.R. 1280, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. As with H.R. 1, this bill will be familiar to our returning members as the House passed an identical bill last summer. Unfortunately, while I think this bill is well-intentioned, it too is misguided. The reforms contained in H.R. 1280 will do more harm than good. I do not doubt the majority's good intentions with this legislation. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act came about following the tragic events of last summer. George Floyd's death demonstrated what so many Americans know only too well, that abuses of power clearly exist and must be grappled with. And while the overwhelming majority of law enforcement officers faithfully and bravely carry out their duties and responsibilities each day, all too often many Americans receive different treatment due to the color of their skin. Americans across the country rightly condemn this horrific and unacceptable act. Unfortunately, rather than choosing to come together to legislate in a bipartisan manner, the majority chose to take the exact opposite course last summer, and we are once again considering the same flawed and deeply partisan bill we considered then, and that the Senate failed to take up. I believe this bill will face the same result should the House pass it again this week. During the last Congress, when the Judiciary Committee met to mark up this bill, the majority completely shut out Republicans from the process. Republicans made good faith attempts to work with the Democrats to find common grounds on needed reforms, yet every single one of these attempts were rejected. This year, the majority has not even deigned to bring this bill to a markup at the Judiciary Committee, and once again, the majority have shut Republicans out of the process. This is no way to legislate on an issue that is this important, Mr. Speaker. Republicans and Democrats alike agree that reforms are necessary. We all watched the tragedy of George Floyd unfold last summer, and we all watched the resulting protest, and we all agree that action is necessary. But rather than working together in the best interest of the American people, majorities once again telling Republicans that they can only have a Hobson's choice. They can take the Democrats' bill or they can take the Democrats' bill with no other options. But I, along with my fellow Republicans, reject that idea. We fully recognize the critical need for reform. My colleagues both in the House and in the Senate have put together our own reform package, the Justice Act, filled with bipartisan reforms that could pass both the House and the Senate and be signed into law quickly. These reforms include critical measures like providing funding for body cameras for police officers, requiring de-escalation procedures, and banning chokeholds. My colleague, Representative Stauber, offered this as an amendment at the Rules Committee earlier today. But once again, the majority chose to shut out Republicans and refused to make this amendment in order. That's a sad state of affairs, Mr. Speaker, but the real loser here are the American people. This is an issue we can and should cooperate on. I urge my colleagues in the majority to rethink the path they are on an issue that is important, that is this important and this critical to the American people. The very best thing we can do is work together. And with a reduced majority, I think that would actually be good political advice for my friends. We can work on bipartisan reforms together, and we can produce consensus legislation that has the buy-in of members of both sides. But unfortunately, the majority has once again chosen the opposite path, partisan bills filled with provisions that do not reflect the best interest or consensus of the country. We can do better than that, Mr. Speaker. The American people deserve better. With that, I would urge opposition to this rule and the underlying legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.